how's it going, folks? This is our second podcast. Today, we're going to talk about Yukio Mishima, his life, his work, his philosophy. And here I'm with my guest, M. We're just going to call him M. He doesn't really, or I'll say he likes the word M. He likes to be called M, and we'll leave it at that. So, yes, in my name, as you guys already know, the Miggia, or as I say, Mittacast, I spelled it wrong. But yeah, Mittacast and my friend M. So yeah, go ahead, M. Let's go ahead and start the conversation.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the Japanese author Yukio Mishima, who is not just an author, he was also a film director. He did incredible photographs, which he modeled for. He was also probably the first celebrity bodybuilder in Japan, and he also created his own private army. And there's probably a lot of other things that I've forgotten. Oh, he acted in some films. Not only was he a director, he also acted in his own film and acted in other films. And yes, he had his own private army. And there's yeah. Do you want to continue?
I mean, you basically hit it all. I was just saying to sum it up, he's a man that wears many masks, no pun intended, or pun intended.
Yeah.
How you want to look at it.
Yes, and actually, that reminds me that in his book Sun and Steel, he actually mentions masks specifically when talking about how the Earth is surrounded by death and how at the upper regions of the Earth you cannot survive unless you actually wear a mask, and he calls it a mask, the oxygen mask. And I think that's actually very closely intertwined with his like fundamental belief about the world. And he wrote this book, Confessions of a Mask, which is his basically autobiography, slightly fictionalized, but in general, it describes his own life. And I would definitely recommend that. Just to give more of an introduction, I'd also say that I haven't read that much of his work, so I'm not that authoritative on it. So I'll say, based off what I know, and I think also it's worth mentioning how he ended his life, which is that I believe it was at the age of 45, he uh, went into the Japanese embassy to kind of stage a coup. But what he did was he gave a speech talking about how, like, the decline of Japan and how Japan needs to be saved from like capitalism and the West and everything like that. And his plan for this speech, which was something he had basically planned his most of his life, was that after he would deliver the speech, he would commit seppuku or harakiri, which is a samurai form of suicide in traditional Japanese method. And he did that, and that's how he died, which I think it's important to say that in case anyone listening doesn't know.
Yeah, that is very important. One thing I wanted to add to that is that people usually interpret his death or his seppuku as a type of like political like a fascist proclamation of like modern society. And I say to that is like that's not necessarily the truth. Mishima was a very complex guy, like we talked about earlier with Mass. And ultimately everything with Nietzsche's life was about creating your life as a work of art. And on top of that, Nietzsche with his art, not Nietzsche. Did I say Nietzsche the first time, or did I say
Yeah, I think
Mishima?
you did. I was going to correct you, but
Okay,
it's
Mishima,
okay.
my bad. I'll
There's a
get to
reason why you're saying it. There's a lot of connections between
Yeah,
them.
that's what I said.
So
Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, Mishima with life, you create like meaning and purpose. So like a lot of what's going on in the post-war era. I mean, a lot of people. I mean, we know this in a way. Like we've talked about, or like you've looked in contemporary or survey history of modern Japanese or Western history, or not Western global history. You talk about the war, World War II. You talk about the bombs. You talk about the Holocaust, but people really don't get into the details of like what that did to the psychology of the minds of the people who lived in Japan. You know, Japan prior to the Second World War was essentially a continuous culture. I mean, you've had revolutions in the past. You had Meiji Revolution. You had the Bakufu of the 17th century with Tokugawa family, all that stuff. But with that, deep within that, you still have what the Japanese like Misha would call like the Nippon spirit. They still read the classics. They still spoke in Japanese. They still worshiped their gods. They still revered the emperor as a god. But when you get to 1945, at the fall of the date of the war, the American government removes all that. Like now, at the core of Japanese identity is nothing. And I say that helps explains a lot of the culture output of the last 80 years from Japan, but also it explains Mishima's thinking and when he says or he does what he did in 1970 when he commits suicide. Because essentially, these people are zombies. No offense, I love Japanese people. I think they're very intelligent and very respectable culture. But I think a Japanese person, even of this day and age, would say or agree with I say with that is that the culture has no substantial identity, or the quality of their identity is not as luxurious as it was before the occupation in 45. So yeah, that's essentially what Mishima is trying to say with that. Because I don't think Mishima, or what I've read of Mishima, and I've read a little bit more than Mark of Mishima's writings. What I understand from Mishima is a decadent. He's a decadent in the sense of his influences and also how he writes. Mishima doesn't write like a strong, staunchly radical, Iki Akira. I don't know if you guys are familiar or Mark, if you're familiar with and I could be saying his name wrong, but Iki Akira, I think that's how you say his name.
Yeah, I don't
Iki
think I'm
Akira.
familiar with him. Sorry.
Yeah, he was a revolutionary in the 20s and 30s, and he tried to overthrow the government in the 30s. He's not writing like that. That guy is obviously like a radical political right wing figure. Mishima is a aestheticist and he's an artist first, which he takes his culture of Japan or Japanese culture to inform his writing, but he's still writing within the confines of modernism, right? I think of Confessions of the Mask, one of my favorite scenes in the novel when he talks about his awakening, his sexual awakening as a man, or knowing who his or revealing his sexual identity to himself as a gay man, where he looks at the image of Joan of Arc, where he thinks the shield or the armor is a man because he doesn't see the girl's face, but when he looks closely and looks at the eyes, it's a woman's eyes. And it's like, oh shit, essentially this is a feminine man, right? Or there's another scene in the same book, Confessions of a Man's, well written. I love this. I mean, just for the imagery alone, how the way he evokes the imagery, it's like midnight, and this is not like historically accurate. It's fictionalized. Saint Sebastian, right? He dies. He's one of the Christian martyrs, the early Christian martyrs. But before Halloween, Mishima describes his death is he has his languid bath of all these, you know, beautiful women, and he's really focusing on the body of Saint Sebastian, then also the eventual death where the air was Pierce's very fresh and firm youthful body. This is all a sign, symbolism of decadence. Another scene I want to talk about before I move on is a scene later in the book where he talks about it's like right out of a French novel, like a Marquis de Sade, where you have, excuse me, essentially he's having like this cannibalistic banquet where, or this cannibalistic slash sadistic banquet where he has this guy on the table and he has his butler pierce the guy's flesh with a knife, just gently, so a little blood can come out and he tastes it. You know what I'm saying? That is not a radical right wing fascist revolutionary. This is a man of his time and also a man beyond time, because with these images, he's invoking a more transcendental ideal of, you know, beauty, death, honor, so on and so forth. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I basically I completely agree with that actually. I was also going to say that, yeah, you can call me Mark from now on. I think that's probably easier because that's my name. And
Okay, I was
yeah,
just making sure.
yeah, the other thing. So one thing I was going to say is that, yeah, the explanation that his death was just a political thing is just so completely wrong, because almost all of his books, or at least the ones I've read and the other ones that I know a bit about, just focus so much on death and the importance of just being able to control your own death. And he even uh, made made a film like
Yes,
sometime
patriotism.
yeah yeah, I think Patriotism, right?
Yes, great
Where he
film.
actually, it was kind of like the rehearsal for his final suicide. But it's also not like those things are completely separate either. He definitely has this conservative, traditionalist, you could call it far right and fascist view. But at the same time, he also is really globalized. He takes from people like Nietzsche. I think he's referenced Dostoevsky. He was really inspired by seeing Greek culture for the first time. So kind of when Japan entered this turning point that you're talking about in 1945, where like all of Japanese culture became questioned, he incorporated both sides, both of wanting to return to the traditional Japanese culture while also looking out at the new like European Western world and like all these other cultures that he could then draw on for his writing. And actually, yeah, you mentioned this earlier. Nietzsche is one of the biggest influences for him. And at the end of his book Sun and Steel, which is I think his maybe most philosophical work, he actually says that he saw this image of a snake and he describes it as this snake that is eating its own tail, circling the globe, which is clearly kind of a reference to this Ouroboros. And he describes it as this eternal process. And it's something that he also describes seeing as he goes up higher and higher in his plane. And he says like 28,000 feet above the ground when he sees this image. And that actually reminds me of one of Nietzsche's first notes, or I believe it was Nietzsche's first note that he ever wrote about eternal recurrence, where Nietzsche actually said that he realized the truth of eternal recurrence when he was 6,000 feet above sea level and much higher than all of mankind. And he saw this in the mountains in Switzerland, in Sils Maria. He was overlooking this lake. And specifically, he mentioned the altitude of it. And he mentioned how being at this height allowed him to see this truth. And that's what Mishima is doing, but in a way that Nietzsche couldn't have done this because Nietzsche could never be on a plane. He can't go that high. But Mishima is describing this thing. And he also, one thing he says about the snake is he describes it as something that resolves all polarities. And that's also part of what I think is essential to Mishima, is
Yes,
that he
you're
has
right.
these contradictions that you
Yes.
mentioned. Like,
Yeah, because he.
just
I'm
like how he
sorry.
has this like French modernist aspect. Yeah.
Yes. I'm
And
sorry.
it's,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah, I
I'll
was gonna
say
say
this
it
thing.
seems like a contradiction when you take like the French modernist aspect and this like traditional Japanese aspect, but actually he's doing what he sees that snake doing, which is this like enormous process of ultimate unity that like brings everything together in this like almost like pure like platonic monist sense or something.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say another thing about that with it's like a small thing. It's not too big. When he talks about his political beliefs, I think a lot of that is just because he's Japanese. Because like a lot of Mishima is just like, guys, can I just have my culture? Like, can we have a culture? Um, Modernity or post-modernity, the war has removed the ideal of culture, and this is something that we have a problem with today, where a lot of cultures are being like conformed into this marketplace culture of post, or I guess we'll say hypermodernity, with the digital marketplace of the internet with Amazon, Twitter, so on and so forth, where everyone is essentially told to see the world the same and consume the same, right? And interact with art the same way. I think Mishima, with his staunch Japanesism, I'll say it like that, he's trying to say like, can we have the ideal of difference? The
Yeah.
ideal of different perspective on things, even though I am a Japanese man and I like Greek art or I like French modernism, I'm still Japanese and I'm going to see them through a Japanese lens. Because when he does write, within these aesthetics, it's not, this Japanese guy trying to be like a French guy. No, it's a Japanese guy trying to understand, the life of Japan after the war, right? And all of this, incoming influences from all these different cultures, right? So in some ways I would say Mishima is the first otaku. And if you guys are not familiar, or or Mark, if you're not familiar with otaku means,
I've
it
heard the
means
phrase before, but I don't actually. Yeah, you
yeah, it means
say what it
a
is.
guy who really enjoys anime, a big anime fan, you know. And I say otaku because how the way otaku absorbs information, specifically information regarding the anime medium, is like a database, right? And this is something that Hiroki
But
Izuma talks
isn't
about.
a taco more of a consumer rather than a creator? Because I feel like
It's
Mishima.
both. It's both.
Oh,
It's both.
what
So,
did?
like the Otaku takes a database, or he takes I'll just say symbols from a database, the database of anime. Let's just talk about anime right quick specifically. And with those symbols, he creates a new anime project. But he's still the source of the anime project is from this database. Mishima is kind of doing that on a more global scale with global art forms, or more specifically European art forms, and combining the East with the West, and with that creating a new way of expression, which is still uniquely Japanese, if that makes any sense.
No, yeah, that does make sense. And also the other influence that I briefly mentioned earlier is the Greek and Hellenic influence on him, which seems to be really enormous, and also actually connects, I think, to the Nietzsche influence because Nietzsche was really like obsessed with the Greeks. He wrote multiple books on them, and he saw them as kind of the high culture that should be looked up to when planning or when trying to understand like what makes culture great, and that's what Nietzsche saw, and I'm sure Mishima saw the same thing. And I think he actually said that his inspiration for bodybuilding and for focusing on his muscles came from visiting Greece. And what I think you were talking about this earlier. What was the statue that he saw?
It
What
was
was?
a statue of Apollo,
Yes, yeah,
and
and
there's a picture. I have a picture of it on my computer. But yeah, he
you
went to Greece
you
and he
can put
saw
it
the
up
statue.
as like a visual or something when
Yeah,
you're
yeah, I
ready.
will.
Yeah,
But yeah,
the and one of the things he mentions as well, and I think this is also completely inseparable from his death, is he mentions how in ancient Greek culture you had this belief about how people's deaths, how these early deaths were something that gods were jealous of, and how gods were jealous of humans being able to kind of shape their destiny, and that destiny was synonymous with death, and this was something that yeah only humans could do, and that was his view as well. He thought, I don't want to die as an old man outside of my control. He wanted to die at a time when his body was still vigorous, still healthy, still strong. And at one point, he even mentioned that one of his motivations for building muscle is that he wanted to have a body which had a certain amount of muscle before he could die. He wanted to have it be a certain shape.
yeah.
And that's just so important to him.
Yeah, and that's like going back to what I was saying. We're taking different, cultural symbols from the database and applying to our own. Japanese culture and Greek culture are very similar. I wouldn't say they're the same, but they're similar. They're very similar, especially with their ideal of death and like the heroism of like death. I think of the Iliad, right? You have Achilles. He's talking to, I can't remember exactly. It's been a while since I read Iliad, but he's talking to one of the gods. No, I think he was talking to Athena. Like I said, guys, don't kill me here. I don't remember exactly, but I know he was talking to a god. And let's just say it's Athena for right now. He's talking to Athena. Athena says to him, would you like to go back home with your family, or would you like to live the war out, or would you like to stay here at Ilium? Ilium is Troy, and like continue this fight. And he's like, I want to stay here. And Athena says to him, well, if you stay here, you die, right? You're not going to go back home. And Achilles says, yeah, I'm familiar with that fate. But the thing is, if I go home, I'll just be the guy who went home. But if I stay here, I will be remembered through history as Achilles, the hero who fought the Trojans. you know that sentiment is reverberates back into, like I said, Japanese culture with the samurai. you know One thing about the samurai was not only that they were fighting for honor, but they were fighting for a sense of heroism in, not say spite of, but on top of the honor of the clan or the bukufu, right? So
Yeah, and
there's a
actually, I completely forgot to mention that
lot.
his death was based off a traditional Japanese samurai death, which, yeah, it's not just based off the Greek idea of gods loving men's ability to, or being jealous of men's ability to die early, but it is also this very
Well,
traditional
that's the
Japanese
thing.
idea.
That's what I was saying. Like that's the connection there. Like the connection is ultimately the love of dying for death that is heroic, a heroic death. Because dying is one thing. Because in modernity, we're all going to die, or in post hyper modernity, I'm sorry, we're all going to die. You know, and most likely than not, we're going to die a death that is not heroic or satisfactory in comparison to our ancestors. It's going to be a very mediocre death or a boring death. I keep on saying Nietzsche. What Mishima is trying to do is kind of go back a little bit to the past and die for a death that means something. Because now we have nothing. We don't have anything to stand or fight for. You know, and for like I said, a culture for the most part, before the or after the war, has been continuous. You know, the samurais, of Japan fought for higher ideals that were beyond their own, that meant something. We look at the Shingoku period, all these warring clans fighting for the control of Japan. These people are fighting for the honor of their clan. I'm thinking about Uda Nobunaga or Hideyoshi Tadayoshi. I'm saying his last name right, but the first Tokugawa. They're all fighting for honor, right? I guess you could say politically to control the land, but ultimately they're fighting for the control of the land through their own honor, like through their own name, the honor of the Tokugawas versus the honor of the Nobunaga's. But when you look
Yeah,
in
and
post,
I think just to
go
add a
ahead.
bit, I think you're right that like yeah, there's also the political and cultural aspect, which is kind of inseparable from it, because it's not just oh Mishima is this just one individual and he's just separate from any kind of political or cultural system, but actually he doesn't see himself as just one individual. He sees himself as being so closely connected to Japanese culture and even in some ways connected to Greek culture as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by that. It's like he sees, and he's not a narcissist in this regards. He's a narcissist for other reasons, but he's not a narcissist in this regards because even when he was younger, when he was going through school, he had a mentor of him. I forgot his name. He said to Mishima as he was graduating that you are essentially the spirit of the past, living within the present. You have all the history of all the of knowledge of our ancestors living within you. So, he definitely felt that like, and also when he talks to forgot the guy's name. Do you remember the guy, what's his name? The guy who wrote the book called No Longer Human?
Oh, I don't remember. I think it's like Ozaku or something.
Yeah, Ozomu something.
Osamu. Yeah.
Yeah, Osamu Dazai. When he met him before he died, and I don't like Osamu Dazai personally. I don't like his stories because they're essentially just nihilists. They're what Mishima is going against, and this is what why Mishima will say to Dazai when he meets him that your work is terrible. Because it's completely self-centered in a way that is self-serving. It's is mission topic is selfish. And Dazai says to him, and this is proven Miche's Mishima's point right. Um, you love me. You don't really mean that. You don't really mean that you don't like my work. You love my work. Being into himself, Dazai. So eventually, or I think a week later after this interaction, he kills himself. Dazai does. But that's the point that Mishima is trying to say is that like that kind of personality is detrimental to the health of Japanese culture, and what he was trying to do was trying to revigorate it. Because regardless of how he died, or yeah, how he died, it was still a genuine work of Japanese expression, if that makes any sense. I say that 'cause sometimes I feel like I say something and it makes sense to me, but
Wow. I didn't really know much about Dazai's biography. So is it actually accurate that he killed himself like soon after meeting Mishima,
Yeah,
or
Mishima. I'll send you a link to the interview. I have it saved on my stuff. But Mishima talks about it. Like he talks about it in the interview. One of the few interviews he did in English, where he's like, yeah, yeah. I mean,
and did
everybody.
he give that interview after Dazai had died?
Yeah, this was like I want to say decades after the fact Dazai
And he
died. I think.
described his meeting with him. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, like yeah. That's why I never liked Dazai because like I read under No Longer Human in undergrad, and I was like, this guy is like a fucking. He's like a I hate to use this word because it's so like ubiquitous with the culture or internet culture, but he's like an incel. Like he's truly a bitch. He doesn't want to do anything. You know, he's having these relations with all these women, these very violent and bad. I'll just say bad relationship with women, and he doesn't care. He's like, there's no like end goal to this stuff. He's not doing this for like a high ride, yo. Even if he was, it still would be bad. But that's the point. Like he's not doing anything that is substantial, that has meaning. He's just living life and just being this destructive, vagabond. And like I said, I remember reading it in undergrad, I was just like, yeah, this is bad. This is so bad. And this is like after I read Mishima, because I read him, after I read Not No Longer Human, the sailor who fell with grace,
From
who
Grace from
fell
the
with grace
Sea
with this.
with yeah.
And I remember reading that, I was like, dude, this is like, it's a little disturbing, but it has so much passion in it. Like you kind of want to sympathize with the son, because you get his perspective. You get why he's like this. You get why he's so violent, because essentially he's losing, like, one, he's physically losing his mother, but two, on the like on a metaphysical level, he's losing his nation. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And he's trying to find a way to find meaning within the laws of his nation. And that's Mishima. That's the Mishima writer versus the
And
Zaza.
also, because how old is the boy in the book?
What in boy, you
The
asked me
sailor.
a very tough question because I haven't read that book since I was like
Okay.
23.
Well, it doesn't matter exactly, but one of Mishima's other like repeating like symbols or ideas that repeats over and over again is kind of his love of youth. And
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, it even becomes homoerotic, where he sees young men as just having this extreme beauty that can only be like, that's like so unique and fleeting. And he mentions that like looking at an old intellectual whose youth has passed just fills him with this kind of sense of disgust. And he also has this view of like the unity between ethics and aesthetics, which is actually a view Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein actually had. I think he wrote it down in one of his notebooks. But from Mishima's view, like I just think that's so important to understand, is that for him, every uh, action that is moral is inseparable from it being beautiful, and every action that's beautiful is inseparable from it being moral. So those are not different like axes for him.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that goes back to the Greeks. We talked about before the podcast started, we talked a little bit about Greek aesthetics and why they were so fascinated with like the body and beauty. And with that, it's like, I talk about essentially what is the whole aim of aesthetics, right? The aesthetics or the transcendental aesthetics, uh taking a little bit from Kant here, is supposed to direct your sensibilities towards a certain type of sentiment, right? Like, you have a beautiful object of art, which is beautiful, and because it's beautiful, it makes you want to do good things or beautiful things in the world, versus a ugly work of art, which makes you want to destroy the world, right? That's go to, like I said, not only uh, orient your sentiment towards world, but also how the way you act in the world. And with the Greeks, they took this in mind in a lot of or all of their works of art. And this is why you have the period of art history within Greek culture of the classical, the Baroque, Hellenism, and the late Roman period. Because with that, you see the ethical, with that, you see the ethical values of the culture changing. You know, um, I know I'm talking about plastic arts here, but I want to talk about Nietzsche a little bit because I just can't stop bringing him up. Nietzsche talks about this in Birth of Tragedy with Greek classical theater. When we start with Aeschylus, um, Sophocles, and later Euripides, and with that you see the derivation or the derivation of the ethical values of the Greeks, because by the time you get to Euripides, it's completely decadent, or it's becoming decadent. This is the beginning of Platonic philosophy. And I know we usually relate or we conflate Platonic or the academy with like high level or the beginning of philosophy in Western culture. But in the context of Greek culture and Greek history, this is the end of their culture, because what Plato is philosophizing under is their version of like Protestantism, which is like Orphicism, which is a more rational view of their religious sentiment. Because when you get to the 17th century with people like Rene Descartes, they're essentially doing that with Protestantism. But yeah, that's what Plato and Aristotle and these guys are doing. They're very secular, rational, materialist thinkers, and with that, you have the ending of you know a beautiful aesthetic slash ethical sentiment amongst the Greeks. And this, like I said, this informs Mishima's sensibilities very greatly.
Yeah, actually, back to the philosophy thing. I'm actually just going to read a passage from the start of the epilogue in Sun and Steel, where he says, "Before my eyes there slowly emerged a giant snake coiled about the earth, a snake that by constantly swallowing its own tail vanquished all polarities, the ultimate huge snake that mocks all opposites. Opposites carried to extremes come to resemble each other, and things that are farthest removed from each other by increasing the distance between them come closer together. This is the secret that the circle of the snake expounded. The flesh and the spirit, the sensual and the intellectual, the outside and the inside, will remove themselves a pace from the earth, and high up, higher even than where the snake ring of white clouds encircling the earth is joined, they too will be joined." And I just think this is just a perfect example of how he sees everything in life being united. And one of his main things is trying to unite action with words and language and thought with the body. And he sees it as being united in death. And he also sees the process of unification. It's not really this kind of Hegelian synthesis of things where something contradicts itself and then has to come to some higher understanding of what it is. It's not like a dialectic. Instead, it's just pushing something to the extreme, to the point where it like goes so far above humanity. He uses the metaphor of it being above the earth, up in the clouds, up in the sky, and at that point it all kind of comes together. It like lines up the way that an eclipse does, and that's just something
It
that, yeah,
is Buddhism, is Zen Buddhism, and I think of
yeah,
Temple of the Golden Pavilion. There's a scene in the end of the book, near the end of the book, where he looks at the waves of the sea, and he says that I'm really butchering it here because, like I said, it's been a while since I read it. I'm at peace with myself. And like the whole narrative of the book is about like this Buddhist monk who's trying to like find peace within himself, even though like the world, including his physical nature, is incongruent with peace. You know, and the Zen Buddhist sentiment is this type of non-being, or this nothingness, this eclipse that you mentioned earlier when you was talking from the section of Sun and Still.
yeah. I think that's actually a really accurate connection. There's there's also another philosophy reference where he describes the snake as something that exists, because he says that anything that comes into our minds, even for the briefest of moments, exists, even though it may not exist at this actual moment. It has existed somewhere in the past or will exist at some time in the future. And then, yeah, he says that if this giant snake that came into his brain, uh, if it came into his brain, then it is natural to suppose that it was already in existence as well. And this is something that reminds me of Parmenides, where in his,
Yeah,
I think, like, what's his like poem, or his, I think it's called his poem, like on describing nature or something. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
he identifies thought and being. He identifies what's within human thoughts and what's actually existing, and he thinks that you can't think something that doesn't exist. And it seems like Mishima's taking this. He doesn't just mean but he seems to be doing this in a more kind of archetypal way, where these
Yeah.
kinds of thoughts that enter our mind, it doesn't mean that they reflect something that immediately exists or there's something that immediately exists, but that they can only enter our mind if, he says, even in the past or in the future, this thing has existed or will exist. And that's how it kind of relates to our minds. And this, I think, is also seems to me very similar to the way Nietzsche describes the way the eternal return came to him, because he kind of describes it as this phantasm that just took over his body and took over his entire existence, and it felt so real to him. So this is another place where Mishima is like bringing together, like pushing these polarities to the extremes to the point where they come together, where he's taking like ideas and things that are not real and things that are real and out there, and
Well,
pushing them to a
I
point
also,
where they become one.
it's funny you mentioned that because I think of Shintoism as well as Zen Buddhism in relation to its thought. Because with the Shintoist belief, the living in the live realm is not different in itself, right? They're not like separate domains like heaven and hell is with Christian cosmology. It is the same. You know, the yokai, these dead spirits, inhabit the realm of the living. You know, and with that being said, it's like the thoughts you bring up with Mishima when he says he sees these thoughts, they come of the snake, they come and they go out and they've existed before, so on and so forth. Like the yokai, like I say, in the spirits or the yokai spirits and how they live amongst the living. And they're always influencing the living as well as the present.
So are those spirits in Shintoism, are those spirits from the past?
Yes, they're dead spirits. They're ancestral spirits. And this is
So,
just broader Eastern thinking because not the Japanese, the Chinese have a similar way of thinking about the world as well. But continue.
oh yeah, that is true. Yeah, there is this idea of ancestor spirits. I think it's also kind of in various shamanic belief systems as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what's
So like what I understand of Japanese cultural religious is very shamanistic like that. Is I want to kind of I don't want to say it's animus because the gods are anthropomorphic, but how the way like the mechanics or the ontology of the religious system, it works like a kind of animism. You know, like Japanese people do pay heed to the spirits, right? The ancestral spirits. They do pray to these spirits. They commune with these spirits like they are alive, like they are like you think of Native Americans when they talk about like the deer spirit or the buffalo spirit, so on and so forth. And like I said, this is kind of like a very vulgar comparison here because it's not really the same or too similar. But it's not what I'm trying to paint. The picture I'm trying to paint here is that the what's going to say the Japanese way of being is so different from Western thinking or just Northern European thinking. It's just it's completely separate. And going back, I'm doing like three things here now. Going back to the Greeks, their way, and I'm kind of seeing it now a little bit more. I think what Nietzsche was ultimately trying to do is find something that is because you notice that like with Nietzsche, there's not a lot of Christian symbology within his work. There's a lot of Greek stuff, and it's like because I'm assuming he's trying to find stuff within
well, there is
European,
also stuff like Saint Sebastian, so there is some
but that's a
Christian
pagan
influence as
symbol,
well.
though. Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't know that was a pagan symbol.
Oh no, I'm tripping. I'm tripping. It is not a pagan symbol. You're right, but I guess what I was trying to say with that, how the way he uses Saint Sebastian is in the pagan way. Um, yeah, he's taking Greek or European ideals that are similar to Japanese ideals, like the Greeks, and conforming it to his own way of understanding things.
Yeah, I actually think he does the same thing with Jesus Christ. I believe that he has mentions of him, but he focuses a lot on his body and kind of this more pagan form of him. I'm not uh, sure for sure. But yeah, I think he talks about like the flesh and stuff like that, but I'm not entirely sure about that.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have to go back and read some stuff because like I said, what I remember a lot from Mishima is like a lot of French symbolism, modernist French symbolism, paganism through Greek culture, and like German um modernism and not French, Japanese modernism through Jinshiro Tazanaki and I won't say his Kawabara because I can't say his first name. He's the guy who wrote what's that book called? A Thousand Cranes.
I don't know which book you're talking about.
Yeah, Thousand Cranes is a book that won the Nobel Peace Prize in the '60s. I can't remember the year. It
Nobel
was
Prize for Literature, you mean, or?
yeah, yeah, and it was the only Japanese because the whole thing at the time was like, is Mishima going to win it or is Kurobaru going to win? Because like this was like the first time that they even considered Japanese literature.
I
To me
I remember
now,
hearing, is this accurate that Mishima they were thinking of giving it to him, but they decided that because he was younger, he had a lot more time to live and there would be enough time to give it to him at some point. So that was part of why they decided not to give it to him.
I think I heard that before, but I remember watching the interview because they actually recorded it live on television. You know, when they gave Kurobaru the award, they were like talking about it in a way where it's like, yeah, this is not going to happen again. Like, we're not going to have another Japanese Nobel Peace Prize winner in literature. And I think
Yeah.
how the way he was talking about it, it was like, okay, because this is not going to happen again, I'd rather him get it than I get it, and I just want to be here with him because I feel like that would be like an honorable thing for me to do. Because like I said, he made it seem like, yeah, this is not going to happen again. And from the top of my head, I don't think there ever been a Japanese person who won a Nobel Peace Prize in literature since then.
You mean just a Nobel Prize in Literature, not Nobel Peace Prize?
Oh yeah, Nobel Prize. Sorry, I don't know why I keep on saying Peace Prize. Nobel Prize. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I wanted to say, going back to the thing about ancestor spirits and the way that they are immanent in the present, is that what Mishima is doing is still a bit different because he says that it's not just that if there's an idea or if there's a thought in the mind, that it must also exist in reality in the past, but he also says, or it could exist in the future. So that maybe is a reference to the idea that through action you can make something real, something that starts out in the mind and make it real, which is more of a kind of modern Western idea about the will and about this is one of the things Heidegger notes about the contemporary Western age is it's all about kind of implementing your will onto the world, and that's actually what like Fichte's philosophy and German idealism is about. Is he says like nature is just like this playground designed for humans to enact their will upon it. And that's like the kind of philosophy that might be what Mishima is incorporating to, what is incorporating into that. I don't know.
I like that idea. You could be right because, like I mean, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you could be right. Like I said, I'm just spitballing here because, you
Because
know,
that could be the future aspect. Like the past aspect is this more traditional Japanese idea of the spirits living on in the present, but
hmm
then the other one is about the present ideas living into the future or becoming kind of imminent in the future due
yeah,
to this like enactment of the will, which is also what Mishima did with his death. Is that he had the thought of his death long before his death actually happened, and he had it
hmm
so perfectly planned. Like he had that movie Patriotism where he rehearsed it. He had in a lot of his books. I remember in Confessions of the Mask, he would talk about how he wanted to like die this kind of noble death over and over again, and it was just in his photographs, all sorts of photographs that he modeled for, which involved images of him having committed seppuku. Those were some of the most recurring images he had, and it's just a very perfect example of taking something from being an idea to making it real. And actually, I think the most important thing here is he describes death as being the point where the polarity of language and words with the polarity of language words with body and action, like the thing that joins those things together and yeah, solves any polarity between them. Like that's what the snake does, is it turns those things into death. And that's one of his uh, insights that he got after his entire life of struggling with both of those, because he was just such a masterful writer. He dedicated his whole life to writing, but also he dedicated his whole life to action and to his body and to bodybuilding and to like the careful building of every muscle. And he came to the realization that death is what unifies those two contradictory aspects of his life.
Yeah, that is so true. And this is like a small tidbit here. Talk about his writing, dude. That guy, did you know this? He read Nietzsche at 12.
I didn't know that, but that explains a lot.
Yeah, that dude read Nietzsche at 12 years old, bro.
I think, yeah,
Like,
that,
that's crazy.
yeah, especially at the time, because now you might have more people reading Nietzsche at 12 just because, but they are not going to understand it. I could imagine some, although maybe not 12, more like 13 or 14. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's really, really incredible. Oh, and I think we should also mention the film Mishima, Life in Four Chapters, which is directed
Yeah,
by
I was
Paul
gonna bring that
Schrader,
up.
the guy who wrote the screenplay, most well known for writing the screenplay for Taxi Driver. And Taxi Driver has all of these Mishima-like themes in it, and it's obvious that Mishima is like a great inspiration for Paul Schrader, which is also what makes him such a good screenwriter, what allowed him to like write such a brilliant screenplay. And then he actually both wrote and directed the film based off Mishima's life, which also incorporates multiple of Mishima's stories into it and ends with Mishima's death and even some direct quotations from his book Sun and Steel.
Yes, that's a great film. I mean, honestly, from what is, I guess you can talk about Paul Schrader and his interpretation of Nishima's work because, like, a lot of the film is what we talked about. It's really like Sun and Steel. It's like he took the screenplay, or not screenplay. He took the book Sun and Steel and turned it into a screenplay.
Yeah,
Because, like,
and
go
I
ahead.
would say it was actually I would say mostly it's Confessions of a Mask. I would say it for most of it when it's like his biography and history. There's a lot of direct quotes from Confessions of a Mask, and then near the end, there's more stuff from Sun and Steel, and then also he has Runaway Horses, Temple of the Golden Pavilion, and then I forgot what the other one was. The one,
Okay, yeah. So I do remember that. I do remember the Temple Gold Pavilion, Runaway Horses and stuff like that. But I thought it was like in reference of like he was taking snippets with like the overall
yeah,
story.
those are snippets.
Like,
Yeah, for those ones he takes snippets.
yeah, that's what I was saying. Like the overall story is like I guess Confessions in a Mass with Son of Still, but
Yeah,
like he takes snippets from like various works throughout his life to kind of do like a highlight reel of his life and his work and his philosophy, because like each snippet is like a highlight of his overall philosophy. Like he has a scene in the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. There's a scene in the book with him and the guy that has a voice impairment. I think I can't remember. They're having relations with some woman, or he's having relations with a woman, and in the midst of having, or after he's finished with the women, he looks at this golden temple and he's like having like this aesthetic transcendental moment that we talked about earlier, and that
yeah,
relates to like the contradictions here with the ideal in the body or language with the body. And because like at the end of the film or near the end of the film, he takes the end of the book and where the monk with the impairment burns the temple because he just can't take the fact
all the
that,
beauty.
yeah, the beauty of the thing.
Yeah, and actually, each section of the film is titled. I think the first one is beauty, then it's art, then it's action, and then it's the final one is harmony of pen and sword, which is once again a reference to what death is, which is just the most. When you take like abstract ideas to their most extreme, it turns into death, and when you take the body and life to its most extreme, it also turns into death. And this
Yeah,
is
go ahead.
and this is where it's kind of like this ultimate like point of unity, which is what makes it like so desirable for Mishima, because part of it is also just going to the extremes. Because once like in his metaphysics, uh, once again, it's not Hegelian, it's not this kind of dialectic. Instead, it's just this like rapid push to the extremes, which is much more Nietzschean, but it's also not exactly like Nietzsche, because Nietzsche has more of this idea of overcoming, while Mishima has more of this idea of just extreme, extreme, extreme.
I would say equilibrium, like the breaking to the point of equilibrium.
Yeah.
Because that's what death is. It's like an equilibrium. Like it's like returning back to like a stasis point once you broke the extremes or you push the extremes to its limits.
Yeah, it's basically kind of like the end goal. There's a part of that view. A lot of people understand this, or a lot of people have this view that death is like the end goal of life. And Mishima clearly really thought that through. He didn't just think of it as just an idea, but he really embodied what that means.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, you talked about how it was structured that way. The movie was structured by his ideals. That does make a lot of sense, especially at the end with the Golden Temple. But yeah, Mishima was a very complicated thinking, and I feel like, and I'll talk a little bit about this, and we can wrap it up. Um, I say this too because it's like when you watch or you look through contemporary culture, especially like internet culture and internet discourse, they've paid Mishima as like a right wing figure, like a radical right wing guy, and they try to make him on the same level of like a Hitler or Mussolini. I just think it's a disservice. Um, I feel like if you
Yeah,
look at
it's
Mishima,
really a very superficial reading, because it takes like one dimension of his world, and of like it just takes one of his masks, and then it kind of pushes this as being what he really is. It's pretending that like this one mask of him is also his face, which is just uh, very superficial. And just as important to his life is also his homosexuality, which is another thing that's really explored in the film Mishima: Life in Four Chapters. And even though he was married to a woman and had children with her, he also had an aspect of his life that was homosexual. And actually, just like how these people on the internet who take him and try to turn him into a fascist icon, just like they miss the point by only focusing on one dimension of him, people who would take him and try to say maybe he's some gay rights icon are also missing the point. They're also only
yeah,
taking one
because
dimension
he's
of him.
not like the dude who's going to the gay flag parades. He's a like you said, he was married. He had 2 kids. When he would go to these clubs, he would go in discreet. And he would meet up with
Yeah,
these people in the
and his
street.
wife couldn't even believe it when she found out. She threatened to sue the people that said this about Mishima. She thought it was just not true. That's how discreet he was about it, actually.
Yes, exactly. You know what I'm
Although he
saying?
wrote about it in his books. In Confessions of a Mask, he describes his attraction to other men, and it's obvious that he had an aesthetic attraction for men.
Yeah, that is true. But like I said, it's like you said, it's wrapped up within the multifacetedness of his character and the many masters he wear. I think and this is a problem with like contemporary culture in general. We are unable to look at things in this whole. Like we're
Yeah, it's
unable
always
to
trying
look
to like
at the
simplify or
multiple.
box something in so that it can
Yeah,
be used.
yeah, exactly. Like we're unable to look at things in its multiple aspects and see the big picture of things. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, people feel like if they can't use Mishima for the goal of justifying some kind of argument or to do something to improve their own lives, then he's useless. Because once you define everything in terms of use, then anything, either you have to force it to be useful, which means you destroy what it actually is, or you just discard it and throw it away like trash because you can't find it useful. And that's one of the problems with like the idea of just maximizing how useful something is.
and on that though, I think we're going to end it. That's a pretty good point, man.
Yeah.
So yes, guys, this is a second podcast. Hopefully not the last. I hope you enjoy and have a nice day and like and subscribe. Thank you very much.